Good afternoon, everyone. It's just after 12, so I suppose one should say good afternoon. Delighted to see you all here, and I'm very pleased to welcome Caroline Elkins to Jaipur. She's here for the first time, and she's the author of this formidable doorstopper of a book, Legacy of Violence, A History of the British Empire. And it's, as you can imagine, made an awful lot of waves, but nothing compared to the waves she made with her first book, Imperial Reckoning, in 2005, the history of Britain's Gulag. And that was a story of how the British essentially incarcerated, tortured, and abused people from the Kikuyu tribe in Kenya because they were caught up in the Mau Mau uprising as violent freedom fighters in Kenya in the 50s and early 60s. And during this entire episode, when she published her book in 2005, she was attacked for exaggerating the story of Britain's violence against against the colonies and against the people of the colonies it occupied. Until in the course of all of this, the British stumbled across an archive of hidden files, which revealed that everything she said was not just true, things were actually much worse. And in the files, there were similar accounts from 37 different countries that the British had ruled. And that's what led Caroline to expand her work from a focus on Kenya. She is an expert on Africa. From a focus on Kenya to looking at the patterns around the world as a whole, and that's what led to this book. So I'm going to get Caroline to tell us a little bit the story of how she actually did her original research and that led to this work, and then we'll talk about some of the issues that has been raised by her pioneering research and writing. Welcome, Caroline.
Well, thank you so very much, and thank you for those wonderful introductory words, and my gratitude to all of you for being here, to the organizers for so kindly inviting me, and for those lovely initial words of introduction. And thank you for inviting me, Shashi, on the just sort of what brought me to writing. As you said, this, if all else fails and you buy the book, you don't like it, it will hold your door open in the biggest windstorm that there's ever been. But you know, my first book was called Imperial Reckoning, on Kenya and detention camps in the 1950s during the Mau Mau emergency. And as you gestured to, this book really looked at the systematized violence that took place at the end of empire in Kenya. And we certainly had indications of, if you will, one-offs, indications that the detention camps weren't necessarily all about hearts and minds, but I really sort of dove into this and in some ways excavated what some folks say the untold story. I think others had certainly written about it, detainees and the like, but be that as it may. When I was working on this, I felt as though I had also dropped it into a moment of time, right? That there were colonial officers who had been in Malaya and elsewhere, came into Kenya. They then left and went to places like Cyprus, and all of these different parts of the empire had enormous states of emergency, draconian kinds of violence that lasted for many, many years. And so when I finished up the book on Kenya, I really thought I wanted to explore this sort of how and why was this happening. Kenya was this moment in time. But as you gestured to, the first book, Imperial Reckoning, we had spent some time over breakfast this morning, and I'll recount to everybody what I was telling you, which was, you know, I was a reasonably young sort of historian at the time, and I kind of thought that the first book on Kenya would elicit some pushback. It was just a tidal wave of, some of the, I had one reviewer say, Professor Elkins is a young American woman, full stop, and I was accused of blood libel by our friend Andrew Roberts. I mean, it really sort of went on and on. But what happened is that a few years after the book was released, and it did have some, I always say critical acclaim with emphasis on the critical, and there was a human rights, and there still is, a law firm in the UK named Lee Day, and they decided that they were for reasons of the claimants wanting to push forward, that there was a suit to be had against the British government. And Imperial Reckoning became the first time, the book that became the basis for the research, the first time the British government had been sued by a former colonized population. The case was filed in 2009, and I was expert witness to the case, which, by the way, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. That was a full-time job. And it was partway through that case that, as a response to consistent requests for document discovery, that the British government announced, they called it sort of a special hearing, that they had discovered 300 boxes of previously undisclosed files on Kenya that had been packed up and spirited away at the time of decolonization. And then another
put in some place in Northumberland called
Hanslope Park, which is also known as Spook Central because it's where they keep all the MI5 and MI6 files. And next to these 300 boxes of discovered...
They keep all the files they haven't burned, because the British burned a lot of files.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I haven't gotten there yet, right?
Yeah.
So there are lots and lots. And, you know, Red Fort here, I mean, in Delhi...
There was smoke billowing into the skies of Delhi throughout 1947.
Yeah, exactly. And so, look, you know, I'll sort of cut to the chase, which is the case ended up being much against the odds that many people said. The case was successful. The British government ended up paying out £20 million sterling the first time. It was an acknowledgement of sincere regret, as close as you're going to get to an apology, and a statue to the victims of colonial torture in Kenya. And it was the first time that they acknowledged that torture had happened in the empire. But as we know, the debate still goes on with historians, and in some ways, this is where we intersect, right? Because, you know, I'm doing all this, I'm in the process of writing this book, and your book comes out in 2017, and the difference between those 12 years, and certainly now, and I'm actually curious with you, as we sort of think about it, I see, you know, ourselves as sort of united in this effort to move the dial on how we're thinking about the past and empire. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what that was like.
Well, I don't think in India we had many illusions. Perhaps some people did. But if you look at the British in the 19th century, from the start of the century when they shot people in the so-called Vellore mutiny, right up to the brutal suppression of the, again, so-called mutiny in Delhi. They just massacred people indiscriminately. 100,000 men, women, and children were killed on the streets of Delhi in putting down the so-called Sepoy mutiny. And these were not Sepoys, these were civilians. We had incident, I've recounted one incident in my book, An Era of Darkness, where a young British, you know, Tommy, overhears a conversation that he can't understand between two people speaking to each other in Hindi or a dialect of Hindustani, in which they use the word Kanpur. They may well have been telling each other that they come from Kanpur or that they're going to Kanpur or whatever. But the moment he heard Kanpur, he said, oh, they're talking about the mutiny, and he just massacred them. I mean, he just killed them. And this is the sort of stuff and he testified with pride, that's what he did. There was whole-scale killing. I mean, Jallianwala Bagh was simply the apogee of something. But in terms of numbers, when you massacred 100,000 people in Delhi, then killing 2,000 or 3,000 in Jallianwala Bagh must have looked like, you know, small change to those who did it. So I think you have to acknowledge that violence was integral to the colonial project. And what I think is interesting is that in the second half of the 19th century, for the first time, at least in India, the British came up with a justification in terms of starting to talk about a civilizing mission. They had not done so previously. Previously, and you'll see this in a lot of internal accounts, one of the things I found fascinating was I read a lot of British sources, things like testimony to House of Commons committees that was going on about what was going on by the East India Company. The famous trial of Warren Hastings, which is mentioned by Caroline in this book as well. The impeachment. What you saw was the British had no illusions within Britain of what was going on in their country's name. There was whole-scale violence, loot, expropriation, rapine, all sorts of horrible things happening, pillage. There were mafia tactics. I mean, the East India Company and the Clive would basically send soldiers to a small princely state and tell the chap, you know, you basically need to pay us so much to protect you from attack. And we're going to park our soldiers here. And the guy would say, but I don't need protection from attack. And they'd say, yes, you do, because if you don't pay us, we're going to attack you. That's the way the mafia operates. And that's how the East India Company started its first depredations in the late 18th century. So this is how it operated. They had no illusions about it. As late as the 1920s, and I quote this, there is a British Home Secretary who says to, again, a closed door foreign, domestic, India Affairs Committee in Parliament, he says, we seized Britain by the sword and we hold it by the yardstick. And we will continue to hold it by the sword in our interest. Forget all the cant about doing what's good for the natives. That's not why we're there. So amongst themselves, they had very few illusions. We talked this morning about the letter that Lord Lytton, the Viceroy, wrote to the Empress Victoria, who had pledged in 1858 that she would associate Indians with empire and so on. And Lytton said, you do realize we're not very serious about this. We're not going to put them in any positions that really matter. And even so-called enlightened administrators, I've quoted the memoir of a man called Fielding in the 1890s, who was considered a great liberal by British standards. And he said the entire point of British rule in India is that it's British. There's no way we can let Indians. And he was complaining about the fact, about the first couple of Indians who got into the civil service. And in one case was drummed out of the civil service on trumped-up charges, and the other one committed suicide. These are the kind of situations that Indians went through. So I'm sorry to have ranted on longer than you intended me to, but the short answer is there's evidence in India of the use of violence, intimidation, and what you beautifully call a legislated lawlessness into the maintenance of the British Empire. Now, you've talked about a number of countries beyond India, and I'd like you perhaps to take it forward with a couple of examples for this audience.
No, absolutely. And this is, first of all, I love hearing you talk, so you can keep going on it. That's fine with me. And I'm sure everybody here does too, yes? Yeah, there we go. So, but it sets us up beautifully for our audience, right? Because when we think about, in many ways, what Shashi is talking about in India, we'll start with 19th, but even earlier. And the case that I just mentioned before, Kenya in the 1950s, what this book is trying to do, and I'm so interested in, is connecting the dots with this. What's the narrative arc? How do we explain what happens here, pick a date, 1857, with what happens deep in the heart of Kenya in 1954? And when we think about this, it's an evolution of the relationship between violence and liberalism and the law, right? And when we think about the nature, and I think to your point that you were just saying, so often these episodes are explained as unfortunate one-offs, right? That yes, this was a terrible thing here, and then let's move forward to different places, right? We could go to Ireland at the time of the War of Independence in 1920-21, the burning of Cork, right? We can go to Palestine in the in the 1930s, just before the Second World War and the Arab Revolt. And in many ways, to understand what happens later in empire, one has to understand India and and Ireland and the Arab Revolt, right, in Palestine. And the Palestinian Mandate. And they're horrific things. The leveling of villages, the grinding down of tents, the wiping out of just absolutely the grinding down of the Arab population. And then subsequently after the war, the tables turn. It's now the Zionist revolt, preparing, as many people think, sort of 1948 and beyond. But at that point, then they move on from there. And they go to Malaya, and then Kenya, and then Cyprus. And by the way, Hugh Toy, who is here burning documents in the Red Fort, who is part of MI5, guess where he lands?
In Kenya.
Close. Cyprus.
Cyprus.
Part of this book is so imagine my very disheveled office, right? A wall like this. It's a mapping exercise, because to understand how this happens, we'll talk about the institutions and structures. People are moving across the empire. MI5, colonial service, military, they're the same people moving from place to place to place. And if you just silo yourself to one particular location, which is what we do as scholars, right? We typically, sort of are expert in, but if you break those silos down, then, as I say in this book, it's like a spider's web. You know when you look at a spider's web and you're like this, and you have no idea the intricacy of it. So what I invite you to do is to think about, and the reader within this book, is to step back. Because this book will spin the entire web, and it's only when you step back and look at it in its entirety that you see the enormity of what I call liberalism's fever dream. The idea in Britain was that if they bequeathed anything anything to people of empire, it was good governance. Well, good governance, as you were saying, I talk about in this book so often, in the Mau Mau case and everywhere else we hear, oh yes, this was done, but it was legal. Well, let's take examples of, let's imagine there's a, which happens often, right? And we even think about what happens here, right, with the massacre just before the war. When we think about the fact that there's no laws on the books for X or Y. So what do you just think about it? What do you do if you're Britain? You need to justify this. You render something that had been illegal legal by passing new laws. And it's something that I call, it sounds rather pedantic, but legalized lawlessness. And this happens over and over and over again. Every time that they need something to justify, to render legal what was otherwise illegal, they pass a new set of legislation. And we move from the time in India, particularly in the early 20th century, to what's declared as martial law, to what is later on what we think of as statutory martial law, or what you might be more familiar with, a state of emergency. And those regulations, 149 pages in the case of Malaya and Kenya, massive. And every time they need a new one to justify past behavior, they pass new law. And then, of course, and I'll pause here, you asked me to give examples, I'll keep going on it, right? But what do, which we talked about a moment ago, when it's all done, what do you do with the evidence?
You burn it, or you file it away in Hounslow Park?
You burn it, or you file it away in Hounslow Park, and never in a million years would you imagine that 5 elderly Kikuyu from the foothills of Mount Kenya would file a case in the High Court of London, by the way, inaugurated, the ribbon cut by Queen Victoria herself, to upend and invert the power structure of empire that then enabled the processes to unfold that led to the discovery of all these documents.
One particular interesting detail is when air power was invented, when aircraft were invented, basically during World War I is when they started using aircraft for military purposes. That sadistic imperialist Winston Churchill was a great enthusiast for using air power to bomb the blazes out of the uncivilized heathens. And they tried it out in Ireland first, and then in Mesopotamia, in Iraq. Your friend Arthur Bomber Harris,
yes,
who later became famous for bombing
Dresden,
parts of Germany,
yep,
especially Dresden, back into the Stone Age. It really is extraordinary how violence can be perpetuated through every means at your disposal. We're just lucky the nuclear bomb hadn't been invented at the time of colonial expansion, or some Brit would have used it.
Yes, I think, you touch on such an important point, right? Which is, and in some ways it took me, 850 pages, but to demonstrate how and why this is systematized. In many ways, you can read this book as a critique of liberalism, that violence is adhered to the liberal project when it becomes part of liberal imperialism. And this notion that somehow that this was about reform, et cetera, well, at the end of the day, when you hear about it, and I sort of trace some of this arc, because particularly when we get to the period which we haven't touched about as much, post-World War II, the rules of the international rules of the game have changed, at least in theory. You have human rights laws. You have updated humanitarian. Geneva Conventions are updated. You have the European Convention on Human Rights, which is quite far-reaching. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights, while one can applaud it, is simply that, a declaration. The covenants come much later. But nonetheless, Britain's in a bit of a pickle, right? Because on the one hand, they're at the forefront of some of this, whilst at the same time denying to their subject populations the accessibility, the rights that are bequeathed to them by international law. And in part because, if you think about it, if this is a civilizing mission, and to be quite facile about it, if subjects are yet citizens, then they're not ready yet for the rights and responsibilities of international citizenship. Not yet. And I want to make that point very clearly. The not yet appears in international documents over and over again. When we look at trusteeship, established by the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations mandates, they're for populations not yet ready to stand on their own. When we look at the UN and the non-governing territories, populations not yet ready to stand on their own. Getting back to the critique of liberalism, quite frankly, all the way down to the present day, ask yourselves, when does the yet come? Not yet is always, it's never there. They're never civilized, right? And so the question that I raised...
There were large numbers of Brits right into the 1940s who were speaking of a 1,000-year British Empire in
Entirely.
India. They never understood that this was literally at the imminent point of its own collapse.
But I want you to help me with something, because I do believe in this sort of not yet, and the adhering of violence to the liberal project, this notion that black and brown people, those who were subject of, in different parts of the world, of Britain, of the West, that moment doesn't come. And, pardon my pun, and yet, Rishi Sunak.
Yeah. Well,
And yet, so... help me, Mr. You are the MP, right? So you can help me.
No, actually, I mean, I think it does suggest that Britain has changed domestically, and it's changed also because of empire, right? It's because with all those centuries of empire, they ended up creating a situation in which the colonized had pretty much no other aspiration to aim for than to make it to the metropolitan country. And so you did see a lot of people moving there because the British had indoctrinated them to believing that that was the acme of all that was splendid and wonderful in life that was worth aspiring for. So what you saw these folks doing then was heading there, and that was also before independence in much smaller numbers, and after independence, many people headed that way. The Windrush generation in the UK, from the Caribbean, the West Indies. You had a significant number of people after the tragic events in East Africa, which is an area of your expertise, when particularly in Uganda, Idi Amin's oppression, and in fact his expulsion of British Asians, led to an exodus of people who had a legal right to go to the UK and exercise it. Rishi Sunak is descended from parents who are both actually East African Indians. Now, what's interesting about Rishi Sunak is that he's a very interesting man and he's a good man, and I personally know him and like him. But apart from that is the fact that he is a conservative. And one of the things that's striking is that if you look at the first 5 MPs of Indian descent in Britain, starting with 1892 and Dadabhai Naoroji. Dadabhai Naoroji was a liberal. A couple of the MPs who came after him right up to the 1920s were even communists, like Shapurji Saklatwala, for example. So you actually had people who represented a sort of strain of thinking that would be deemed left of center during the empire. Today you're seeing a brown person getting a ticket from the Conservative, and he's not the only one, there are a number of blacks. In fact, of the 7 major contenders, the first time they ran, when Liz Truss prevailed, at that time, 3 were people of color, and apart from Rishi. And they were people of some consequence in the Conservative Party. So all of this suggests that Britain has changed internally. I remember telling you about this wonderful photograph that came out about 12 or 13 years ago during a protest. It was a backlash against anti-immigration protests, with a lot of black and brown people standing in London holding up a placard saying, "We are here because you were there." And that ultimately is the accurate message to the Brits. They've got to make this accommodation. But what's interesting is with the "we are here's," there's also been a change in sensibility. And when you think of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, when you think of people talking about the need to come up with an imperial reckoning of all the wrongs that were done by empire, then I'm afraid you have to realize that there is something fundamentally different today. As late as the first decade of the 21st century, that moment of hubris when America was invading Iraq, when Neil Ferguson was publishing Empire and hailing the British Empire as the prototype for what the Americans were going to do at the beginning of the 21st century in re-civilizing the world, but using globalization. He said basically it was empire that made the colonized people ready for the advantages of globalization. You had Andrew Roberts celebrating empire. You had Lawrence James describing the British Empire in India as the greatest example of altruism in human history. That was the kind of talk that was going on in the first decade of the 21st century. So I'm delighted there's been a change. That Britain, when I was writing An Era of Darkness, which was published in Britain under the title Inglorious Empire, there was a poll conducted by YouGov, which showed 59% of young people in Britain believed that the empire was a good thing and they'd like to have it back. So I actually wrote, my God, they need this book more than the Indian does, because they need to understand what the empire was actually all about. And that's the thing. But you said something interesting about the liberals. We often forget that liberalism turned out insidiously to serve as a source of justification for empire. If you think of the great so-called liberal thinkers like John Stuart Mill and James Mill and so on in the 19th century, they propounded all these wonderful liberal theories, including expanding notions of the consent of the governed and democracy and so on, but they carefully stressed it did not apply to India, to Indians. And this attitude persisted right through. Churchill started political life as a liberal. He became a conservative. But the fact is that across the spectrum, empire and people of empire were people for whom all the liberal principles were deemed not to apply because they were not ready for it. And I think in some ways that's a subject that merits further analysis, is liberalism's betrayal of the brown and black peoples of empire, which is very sad, because those of us today who are proud to call ourselves liberal in terms of our thinking and orientation are also having to reckon with that particular intellectual history. I think it was Partha Chatterjee who used the phrase, what was it? The rule of colonial difference.
Exactly.
Which is that all this is good, but it doesn't apply to the colonies. That's the rule of colonial difference.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I think you made splendid points here. And in my own mind, I think this question about what happens when liberalism washes up on distant shores, right? I mentioned before, I call it in the book sort of this fever dream, that suddenly it encounters cultures and perspectives and religions that are obviously quite different at the time of John Stuart Mill and others. And yet this sense of, and I want to pick up this thread about sort of civilizing mission, white man's burden, whatever you want to call it, and bring it back again to this present day. I'm fascinated in my own mind. I'm still working out the current prime minister. I have to confess, I'm still, but also recognizing, if we take him as well as the recent death of Queen Elizabeth II. Show a lot of hands. Who watched the funeral? Hands up. Hi. Okay, all right.
I didn't.
Okay, so I did because it's part of my ethnographic study.
Oh, good reason.
Good reason, exactly. I love waking up that. No.
I love ethnographic studies of white people.
Yeah, there you go. But
important for them to understand.
This is my point.
Somebody should go measure their skulls as well. And make them show you their teeth.
I love it. But here's the thing. See, so make no mistake, there's a point why I'm telling this story. She choreographed that ceremony entirely herself. They've been planning it for years. What was it? Operation London Bridge? I don't know, whatever it was. Who was the very first person to speak in her funeral? See if you can guess.
Look, I didn't watch it, so it's unfair to ask me. Who was Who was
right? It was a black woman, the head of the Commonwealth from the Caribbean.
Baron of Scotland.
Exactly. That was done intentionally. So deliberately. Because much like if we read the narrative, it is proclaiming the success of Queen Elizabeth II's civilizing mission. Right there, in front of it. She could have picked anyone in the world, and she picked her. And yet, don't forget, the first 30 years of her reign, there was not a single year when there was not a massively violent state of emergency where colonial subjects were being brutalized, tortured, detained, their lands stolen, and decolonization delayed for as long as possible because they were rebuilding after World War II off the backs of their colonized population. But you sat there and listened. I was reading BBC, I had all different news channels going on. When that woman got up, the number of people who said, commentators, look at the success of the Commonwealth, i.e., look at the success of the white man's burden, was being said on television around the world in 2022. So, in terms of perpetuating the narrative,
It succeeded.
it's extraordinary. It's extraordinary.
There's been a bit of pushback. There are groups in the Caribbean and in South Africa.
No, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
I agree, right? And in some ways, they're quite aware of it. The
Who
spin
use
doctrine.
they use that whole thing to
use-
write about all this. And I think when the Prince of Wales, as he now is, and his lady traveled in the Caribbean, he had some fairly strong reactions.
It was like they were sending the canary into the coal mines. It was strong reaction. Wait a minute. Did anybody see the picture of him? It was iconography from Lord and Lady Mountbatten. I mean, literally the picture of the two of them in the Land Rover that had been used by Queen Elizabeth the first time she'd ever been to Jamaica in the 1940s. Same Land Rover, standing there dressed. And if you looked at now the Princess of Wales, I'm all about the symbolism. The Princess of Wales dress. She looked exactly like Edwina Mountbatten. It's like somebody in her stylist took a page out of 1947 Raj.
Wow, all right. Yeah. Now, one question I should ask you, and I guess we'll be opening it up to the audience immediately after that, but since we are in India, I should ask you to respond to the charge that you have not, in your book, done enough to acknowledge, and they all agree with you, those who are making this criticism, but that you haven't acknowledged the work of the pioneering work of Indian historians on some of the ground you've covered.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you for asking that question, and because so often as writers, we're here at a literary festival. We're not supposed to, as you well know, we're not supposed to respond to criticism, and I take something like that quite seriously, and so I appreciate the opportunity. I think. First, I want to make a sort of a worm's eye view, if you will, response, then a broader one. The worm's eye view response is I was so disheartened when I read that because I thought, gosh, for example, we raised Chatterjee. It was.
Partha Chatterjee, Ranajit Guha,
Oh, exactly.
Gyanendra Pandey.
We'll stick
These
on-
are people who've written about some of these things
course.
of violence in colonial India that they say you've not acknowledged.
Absolutely. And so first, we'll just use Chatterjee as an example. There's about 100 pages of what's called rear matter in the book, including bibliography, but the bibliography is only works cited, because as you know, you can have a 10,000-page book on things of empire. And this particular reviewer had said, well, there's 3 books by Chatterjee, and there's only one footnote that has only one book, and I knew that was not correct. So there's a little bit where I'm going to take a little issue with the representation of my lack
Fair
of
enough.
citation, and I could sort of go on and on. That said, the bigger question to me is why have I left that impression on someone? Because I take it quite seriously that I'm actually reading works, not just from India, but from Africa and elsewhere in the empire. One of the things that I do, which I should have said at the start of the book, is I draw upon black radical scholars or writers at the time, people like Padmore and C.L.R. James, in part, particularly Padmore, because Padmore is writing during this period of time in the 1930s and 40s about what he calls he labels what the British are up to fascist imperialism. That's how he and others, he says, are experiencing what's happening in the empire, in the British Empire. And the point that I make is that for those who were living at the time in empire, it's but shades of difference, whether it's fascist imperialism or liberal imperialism. But for you and I today, and I would encourage others to be thinking about this, there is a fundamental difference. This is not fascism. I think what's very important for us to remember, it is a liberal, all of this is happening under the banner very much of liberalism, and when liberalism is imposed or transported, if you will, through the imperial project. And that's what I mean by what we see happening in places like India, and places like the Caribbean, and places like Africa. We see violence adhering to what is ostensibly a liberal colonial project. And it continues in different ways, and we can have conversation. Anybody want to talk to me, I can talk to you till the cows come home about this, but how this continues even into the present day. The ways in which violence adheres to the liberal project. And I think it's something that we should be talking about and, quite frankly, be concerned about.
No, I understand that, and it's fair to say, I think Caroline is right to say that, the British were not the Nazis. They actually were the first to invent the idea of the concentration camp. They put the Boers into concentration camps in the 1890s, but they didn't gas them to death, which the Nazis did to the Jews. And in all fairness, I would say that one of the things that helped us with our freedom struggle was the British were capable of feeling ashamed by the exposure of their own brutalization. So when a Gandhiji went on a hunger strike unto death, the British were actually concerned that he shouldn't actually die, and they took the issues seriously. Whereas the Nazis would simply have cheerfully allowed him to pass away if they'd been ruling and say, that solves the problem, he's gone. So, I mean, there is a difference. But from the point of view of the person being shot, whether you're shot by a German Nazi SS officer or by a British, private who believes in, what was that wonderful phrase? Commerce, Christianity, and
civilization.
And civilization.
The three C's.
The three C's of the British Empire. Commerce, Christianity, and civilization. I'm not sure from the point of view of the person being killed, it made any great difference who killed you, right? So that's the essential answer. You're right that they were different, and you're right that that's why the Nazis ended the way they did, and the British Empire ended with transfer of power rather than bloody revolution pretty much everywhere. But it doesn't take away from the fact that there was a lot of killing going on. There's this lovely old sketch. I don't know how many of you are fans of Beyond the Fringe, Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. And there's one in which one of them is playing Prince Philip going off to Kenya for the moment of independence. And he says, I'm going in a symbolical capacity. And then the interviewer says, and what do you symbolize? And he says, capitulation. But anyway, so at the end of all that, he's talking about the Mau Mau. He says, we thought they were terrorists, but now we realize they were freedom fighters. So then the guy says, well, what's the difference, says the interviewer. And Prince Philip says, not a great deal if you're being disemboweled by one. But from the point of view of the disembowelee, does it matter whether it's a terrorist or a freedom fighter? You could turn the same thing around and say, does it matter whether it was a Nazi or a Brit? But there we are. I think we should get the audience's questions in,
Just
Caroline.
One quick
last
follow-up on that, though, which is, I would also add one difference is you and I sitting here and trying to explain that, yes, in fact, the empire was riddled with systematized violence. The nature by which the Orwellian doublethink happens because of sort of liberalism and violence, as opposed to fascism and violence, it's there. You don't need to write 850 pages to make a sustained argument about that. And I think that's what's so vexing today. Even getting back to your 60% or 59% of the youth, there's still many, many people in the UK today that empire was a force of good, something to be proud of. And I think that begs, and why it is that imperial nationalism continues in Britain, begs explanation in ways that it doesn't have to with the German Empire.
As recently as 2019 or even 2020, I can't remember, there was a British minister who actually said in a radio show or a TV show that Britain is the only country that has nothing to apologize for in the 20th century. Nothing to apologize. This is the 20th century. Jallianwala Bagh, the Mahama massacre, the Malayan so-called emergency. I mean, you go issue after the bombing of the Irish and the Iraqis. I mean, there's so many brutal, grotesque atrocities committed in the 20th century by the British, and he says there's
First
nothing
30 years
But
of
there's
Queen
this
Elizabeth's
veil
reign.
drawn over it, and that's the problem. Colonialism is sort of gauzy soap operas like the Far Pavilions, rather than anything about the realities. And Caroline's book, in my view, is a very welcome corrective to the idea that there was something essentially benign about the imperial project. There wasn't. It was about loot, expropriation, and pillage, and it was made possible by and sustained by the brutal use of violence. And that's been conclusively confirmed in 850 pages in The Legacy of Violence.
But and a great book, can keep the door open.
Yeah, it does indeed. So, a couple of questions from the audience. We have, I think, about 7 minutes. Oh, they say 5. Sorry, 5 minutes. Who's got a mic? Yeah. There's a young man right in front. There's a lady on the second row. Third row. Okay. We'll take 2 or 3 perhaps together, Caroline, then you can answer them all. Yeah.
I hope you had seen a movie, Zulu. It's a 1964 movie. It shows the narrative that British soldiers are fighting the native Zulu people. And it shows that they are the heroes. The Britishers are the heroes. 150 men hold of 4,000 Zulu tribals. So, isn't there some distortion of narratives? We show some people as heroes and they are not heroes. The empire, it is based on colonialism and violence.
You haven't seen all the movies of the 1930s and 40s about India. Ganga Din, The Lives of the Bengal Lancers. I saw them for the first time on TV in America. And I wondered why the bad guys kept winning at the end. But anyway, the lady who's in the first seated row, yeah, she has a hand up.
Thank you, and I think it may not be so relevant historically, but isn't there a pushback in terms of Meghan Markle?
Meghan Markle.
Oh, yeah,
first.
she makes an appearance in the epilogue.
Yeah,
of my
so
book.
there isn't that again some kind of a pushback by a by a person of color? I mean, would you like to comment on it?
Happy to.
Okay, so we'll come back to Caroline on both these questions, Zulu and Meghan Markle and the gentleman at the back. So somebody at the back gets a chance as well. Otherwise, we always tend to confine ourselves to the front.
Hi, on behalf of everybody, thank you for the last 1 hour, firstly.
Thank you.
You'd mentioned that Britain was changing from the inside, Sunak being one example of that. And I'm taking that as them being more accepting of people of color and so on
Right,
and so forth.
right.
But you have Brexit, which seems to be diametrically in the opposite direction.
Right.
So I just wanted to understand your take on what seems to be a paradox.
Sure, I can respond to that. Shall we have, since you're at the back anyway, one more, the lady at the back in blue. Stand up, ma'am. Yeah. And then we'll better get to answers or we'll run out of time.
Thank you both for being here today. I wanted to ask a question, Professor Elkins, about your methodology. Something that you've both brought up and that I'm very curious about is the role of the civilian, both as a subject of violence, a subject of resistance, and in this post-colonial era. And I'm wondering if beyond the documents that are arising or perhaps that we'll never have, if there is a place for things like oral history, and subaltern studies in your work, and so I'm just wondering if you could expand on that. Thank you.
Excellent. I think we'll have to stop there. I'm really sorry. I know lots of other hands went up, but we have run out of time. Caroline, will
Yes.
you answer the
I'll
three
answer
questions
three
that
and
apply
then
to you,
I'll
and I'll get back to them
Give
on
me the
Mr.
last
Sunak.
word.
Yeah.
Just very briefly, to the first two questions first of all, on the film, I'll speak more generally, which we obviously haven't had time to talk about, but make no mistake, Empire was big business.